Devine. I am the planning manager with the City of El Cajon.
Hi, my name is Alfonso Camacho. I'm an associate planner with the City of El Cajon.
And I'm Spencer Hayes. I'm also associate planner with the city.
Okay, great. So we're going to run through a couple polls just to get to know everyone a little bit better. So we're going to start with the first one, which is who is in the room. So if you go ahead and select an answer and tell us a little bit about you, whether or not you're a resident, maybe you're a real estate broker, maybe business owner, community stakeholder, employee in El Cajon. And so we can get a better idea for who's participating in the meeting today. I'll give you a few more seconds if you want to. There should be a box that popped up open on your screen, and if you just want to select one of those options, that would be great. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and close the poll now and share the results. These are completely anonymous, by the way. So it looks like we have mostly community stakeholders, one resident homeowner participating with us today. And then the next thing that we'd like to know is what brings you to the meeting today? So what are you most interested in hearing about? Is it housing, safety, environmental justice? Are you really interested in all three, or maybe something else brought you to the meeting today? I'll give you a couple more seconds if you haven't had a chance. Okay, so it looks like most people are interested in all three elements, which is great because we're going to be going into some depth on each one. So we will be covering all three of those. And we're going to move on to the next one. We're bringing up a map right now, and we've identified various areas in the city. And we'd like to know what area of the city you maybe live, spend a lot of time in, maybe work. And so you can identify multiple areas. And so the first one would be kind of the area around Fletcher and Cuyamaca on the west end of town, El Cajon and West Main, also on the west end, kind of central, Mollison and East Main, Broadway and Mollison are on the northern end of the city, Chase and Magnolia on the south end, Navajo and Fletcher Parkway on the west, or maybe Greenfield and Madison on the east end of town. So I know that was a lot to cover right now, so I'll give you a couple seconds if you want to tell us where you're spending most of your time in El Cajon. Okay, well, we'll share those results now. And so looks like a fair number of people spending time on the west end of town and around Fletcher and Cuyamaca, Navajo and Fletcher Parkway. Some folks more on the south, and maybe a few on the north side at Broadway and Mollison. Great, well, thanks for sharing the information. We'll get to know you a little bit more later on in the meeting as we go through some more discussion questions, but we can move on to the next slide now. So in order to give everyone some background on what we're doing here, we just thought we'd want to inform everyone about what a general plan is and specifically what that means for El Cajon. So all cities and counties in California prepare long-range plans. They look forward about 20 to 30 years, and they plan for different types of land uses. So they identify areas where new housing should go, commercial development, industrial development. And they also contain policies to guide that new development. Those could be policies about the form that development should take, or policies in and around other infrastructure in the city about where new roads may go. And then there are also policies that guide decision-making, whether that be for decision makers such as city council or planning commission or staff. An example of something like that would be policies that direct the city's capital improvement program to invest in specific areas or specific types of infrastructure. And state law does require that we address certain topics in the general plan. Some of those that we just mentioned were the housing, safety, and environmental justice elements, but there are also other elements or chapters that are addressed in our existing general plan, as well as other mandates and guidelines from the state on how we update and amend our general plan. Next slide.
Yeah, and I just wanted to walk through a kind of an overview of the schedule for the project in terms of the updates. So as you're probably aware, since you're here, we're currently continuing our public outreach. We plan to have draft elements, within the next couple months or so. Between October and December, we're looking to have a public review of the draft element, as well as start drafting the environmental document that kind of accompanies these updates. January through February, looking at public review of that environmental document, making those edits based on the feedback we get from the community, City Council, Planning Commission regarding those draft elements, and then also preparing for the public hearings to actually implement the new updates. And that would be occurring between March and April of next year, hopefully. But currently, I think most importantly, we do have a couple of ongoing outreach items, and those are the housing element survey, the environmental justice survey. We have kind of an overview document of the housing element, which is the story map. And then all of these different resources can also be reached from the city's website. It's a pretty easy URL to remember, www.cityofalcohome.us/plan. And again, you'll find links to all those different surveys at that website. I think we might also try to reach out if you have any questions at the end of the meeting about getting those links. And so I wanted to kick off kind of the overview section here. The first one is going to be a discussion of the housing element. And as Melissa mentioned, all cities in California must have a general plan, and that must include a housing element. The housing element is generally updated every 8 years or every 8-year cycle, and it should include a number of things. There's a few required portions that go into the element. The first being an assessment of the population and housing statistics. So that's anything, it would include something like census data all the way to projections for how many new residents we could expect, the size of households, that kind of data. We should assess the barriers to housing development. So that could be things like governmental constraints in developing new housing, or it could be even assessments of, on the private market side, what those barriers might be. It should assess the progress that we've made so far based on our last housing element in meeting our housing needs. It also includes a section specifically for looking at potential sites for future housing. And so that's obviously a fairly important part of what we're going to be looking for your feedback on. And then finally, kind of based on all those previous assessments, what are some new programs and policies that help us meet our housing goals, help us meet the community's housing needs moving forward. So those policies and programs that are established also help us to meet other kind of state requirements. Specifically, the big one would be our RHNA, our Regional Housing Needs Assessment Allocation. This cycle, we're looking at roughly 3,200 additional units within the city. And so again, all those things combined, especially the programs and policies, will help us to get there. And I do think we have a poll here, and that one being, what is the most important issue facing El Cajon in terms of housing? We have a few kind of general options here: housing affordability, supply of housing, housing for special populations such as senior housing, the supply of emergency or transitional housing, and then if you think there might be some sort of other need, please mark other. I think we'll leave this open for a few more seconds. Hopefully we can get a couple more responses in here. Awesome. Okay, I'm going to end that poll, and I'll share those results. So it looks like kind of a spread, but supply of housing did come up here, as well as emergency and housing affordability. So I think with that, we'll move on.
So now we're going to turn to the environmental justice element. And this is a relatively new element that came about because the state passed a law in 2016, SB 1000, and that requires cities who contain disadvantaged communities to develop a new element or include policies throughout their general plan, which address the pollution burden that some communities experience and the health risks associated with that. And it really directs cities and counties to prioritize improvements and investments within these areas. And disadvantaged communities are defined by the state, and in recognition that there is a historic past in California of lower income communities and communities of color being located in areas where they experience higher rates of pollution. And some of these pollution types could include poor air quality or proximity to hazardous materials stored by industrial businesses. And then there are also some other factors that these communities experience. They may not have access to public facilities, or maybe not the same access that other communities experience. They may have issues with accessing healthy food options, and as well as having safe and sanitary housing. And that there also may be barriers to residents within these communities engaging civically. So being able to participate in city council, planning commission meetings, neighborhood organizations, and that type of thing. Next slide.
So the safety element of the general plan addresses natural and human-made hazards, the risk to human life, property damage, and economic and social dislocation from hazard events. This is a required element and must be addressed by every city in California. The city's current safety element is required to be updated, which will address today's current environment. The safety element helps prioritize actions that address the greatest risk to El Cajon in the next 20 years. For example, air pollution. While the future level of air pollution will depend in part on state laws mandating standards for fuel efficiency in cars and trucks, the current air quality in El Cajon doesn't meet standards. Extreme heat, which includes urban heat island effect, which occurs when dark surfaces such as streets and roads absorb heat during the day and release it at night. Flooding. The floodplain most often refers to the area that would be inundated by a 100-year flood or a 500-year floodplain, such as being flooded in a year. These estimates are based on historic observations. However, these flood events are projected to happen more frequently due to climate changes and more intense rainfall, as well as increased urbanization. Geologic hazards are natural geologic processes that with the ability to impact life, health, or property. El Cajon is vulnerable to geologic and seismic hazards that include landslides, slope instability, earthquakes, liquefaction. Hazardous materials, can potentially be found anywhere in the result of improper disposal or storage. However, sites with large concentrations of hazard materials with known contaminants are cataloged. Wildfires can start outside and spread into the city, or can create dangerous air pollution by blowing ash into the city. Developed areas such as El Cajon have a lower fire risk than the rural areas in the mountains where regionally wildfires begin. Portions of East and West El Cajon are located in high fire severity zones. Some of this outlines the existing conditions as well. Safety element, hazards, of course, vulnerability, also goals, policies, and actions. The element would include mapping and identification of known seismic and other geologic hazards, as well as identifying the existing element. It might need to be amended for compliance with state law, which include data, maps, tables, etc. So our next poll will ask, which safety hazard do you feel least prepared for? We'll give you guys some time to answer those. Okay, so it turns out exposure to hazardous materials is kind of along the leader on this, and would be addressed in identification of sites.
All right, and then moving on, excuse me. Moving on, then I can think we're pivoting into a discussion more of, moving forward from our existing elements into the new. So in planning for housing, I kind of want to discuss uh, and provide examples of what has occurred recently and what might, be brought about by further updates to the general plan and to the housing element. So a couple of things that have happened recently. The city's implemented a mixed-use overlay zone, which allows for a mix of both residential and commercial uses, primarily in the downtown area, but also along Fletcher Parkway to the west and then out on East Main. We've also implemented a transit district specific plan, kind of centralized around the trolley station, changing over some of those previously industrial uses to residential, changing the zoning a little bit to allow for a little bit more density around that, transit station. And then we've also just very recently, within the last month or so, adopted a emergency housing ordinance, which allows for some of our publicly facing agencies to locate or construct emergency housing structures at their sites. And so those are kind of examples of different outcomes that might come about. The housing element in itself doesn't program for those specific things, but it kind of allows for these changes to happen through the programs and policies. And I also wanted to bring up some of the other project sites that were developed during the last cycle, kind of as an example. A big one that comes to mind offhand is the large single family development to the east on East Main Street, which was Main Ranch. That was 139 new single family homes. Another good example was the Cornerstone Place project, which was a 70 unit low income development for, for veterans. And then also want to talk just briefly about kind of some of the programs that are in place under the last element. Those include things like the first time home buyer program. So the funding to assist those first time home buyers in acquiring their first home. For example, we also have a rehabilitation loan program to help existing residents who might need a little bit of assistance in updating their homes. And then the last thing I want to kind of talk about here and kind of the bigger element is how moving forward we might identify new sites for housing. And I will bring up now our story map, loading in another tab here. So this is our story map for the housing element update. And if you scroll down here, well, first you'll see that we have the survey embedded. So please take the survey if you visit this site. But also we have these few maps. This first one here, and again, these are just kind of overview examples of what we might look for when assessing new sites for housing. This one here kind of shows the existing zoning, the density, and what you might expect from the affordability given that density. So high density, high affordability, low density, low affordability. And you can see kind of how that lays out with the existing zoning in the city. Then we might also look at things like the improvement to land value of certain properties. So this map assesses, where the land value is very high, but the constructed value is low. So maybe there might be opportunity there for some rehabilitation or potentially some new housing development. Another factor we might look into is if there's potential to subdivide some of the larger lots within the city. Not all of these might be subdividable. A lot of this is, open space. But if there's potential there, then there might be some potential for new single family development or something of that sort. And then one other thing that I wanted to mention briefly is some of the state regulations require us to look at all of our half-acre or larger vacant sites. So these are highlighted in kind of this pink color here. But basically, these are currently vacant and might have potential in the future for development. So let me jump back to the PowerPoint. Maybe we'll continue on.
All right, so what are some conclusions from this initial data? The data would show that there are more extreme heat days, flooding potential, air pollution. What are some things that could help? So we're talking about, for example, air pollution. Green infrastructure can reduce air pollution by providing trees and parks that filter out air pollutants, providing places to walk, bike, and play, away from busy roads. When it comes to heat, recommending tree planting can in concentrated areas with high levels of walking could help alleviate heat downtown and high density areas. So flooding, what we contribute in the San Diego County multi-hazard mitigation plan, which include multiple flooding related policies. Many of these policies include developing future plans. The mitigation plan policies most relevant to this general plan include limiting development in hazard areas, using social media to alert residents to hazard conditions, improving public facilities to use for shelters, etc., and minimizing repetitive loss from floodings. So for the mitigation plan also contains relevant policies that disallow new development in areas of high risk of wildfire, maintaining hazard monitoring and decreasing hazard response time in the event of a wildfire. Infrastructure improvements can include defining emergency response vehicle routes and ensuring there will have a space to maneuver and operate in all high-risk areas and sites. These and other policies contribute to help reduce the risks within the city as part of the safety element.
Okay, so turning back to environmental justice, one of the key questions that we have to answer in order to be able to proceed with developing that element is what areas in El Cajon should be identified as disadvantaged, meaning they're maybe potentially under-resourced or experiencing higher levels of pollution burdens. And so one of the first things that we look at is a tool called CalEnviroscreen. We're going to pull that up there to show you. And that's a mapping tool the state developed to look at different determinants of what could cause communities to be disadvantaged. So that could be the pollution that they experience, other societal factors like high unemployment rates, low education rates. Spencer's bringing up right now one of our state-defined disadvantaged census tracts, which is the one in Gillespie Field all the way down south to West Main Street, outlined there in blue. And if you look at this particular community, it ranks very high on CalEnviroscreen, meaning that in relation to other census tracts in the state, this census tract has a very high pollution burden. It experiences high rates of hazardous materials or hazardous material sites, as well as poor air quality. And also another key feature of this and other census tracts in El Cajon is a high housing burden. And that means that households spend a very high percentage of their income, over 50%, on their housing. So the state's identified two census tracts. Spencer's clicking on the second one here, which is a triangular census tract near El Cajon Boulevard and West Washington, which experiences similar effects as the one identified above. So going back to the main PowerPoint, this is one tool that we use to look at disadvantaged communities. The other is something called the Healthy Places Index, which also looks at some additional factors, some transportation factors, as well as neighborhood level characteristics, and also things like the percentage of people who are working outdoors who might be exposed to higher rates of pollution. And so what we've come to preliminarily identify is there could be two main areas in El Cajon that could be considered these under-resourced areas. The first is outlined in red on the map, and Spencer's going to go ahead and draw that in there for us in orange. That's the area on the northern central area of the city. A portion of that is identified as Bostonia at the neighborhood level. And then the other portion that we're kind of joining together is an area kind of around the west part of downtown, and then kind of comes up and includes that large census tract that also contains the airport. And so we've started to look at these two areas as two potential major areas that experience, lower incomes, higher pollution burdens, and where we're needing to look at policy solutions to help address those issues. So I'm going to go ahead and bring up a poll while you're looking. Would you please go back to the last slide, Spencer? Thank you. Which is based on your understanding of El Cajon. Do you think that these two main areas reflect the vulnerable or under-resourced areas in El Cajon? So an answer could be yes, no, I think that there should be fewer areas identified. No, I think more areas should be included. Or maybe you're just not sure at this point. And I know we're just sort of scratching the surface of environmental justice here. And as we get more into detail into some of those factors, you might begin to see what goes into determining a disadvantaged community. Okay, so I'm gonna go ahead and end that poll and share the results. It's like a couple people said yes, another one thinks no, maybe additional areas should be included. So I think that'd be a good topic for our discussion in a little while about what areas we really want to identify as environmental justice communities. Go ahead and move on to the next slide. So looking at some of the preliminary data, we can start to come to some idea of what's really important in those two main areas. And we see that pollution is more of an issue for downtown than it is for the Bostonia area, just because of the proximity to industrial uses. We see that both areas experience poor air quality than other areas of the city. And they also, because of urbanization, lack some of that trees and open space that can help mitigate poor air quality. In terms of accessing public facilities and food, we see that maybe the area north of I-8, that maybe that's somewhat of a barrier to accessing public facilities in the southern portion of the city. Both areas have bus access, but neither one is very close to the trolley, which is our higher quality transit option. There's no library nearby in Bostonia, but in the downtown area, we do have the Central Library. And then both areas appear to have grocery stores and markets dispersed throughout the community, but there could always potentially be access issues there. Both communities experience that high rate of rent burden, as I mentioned. And then in the downtown area, we do have an older housing stock, which means that there could be more maintenance issues that could contribute to issues with people accessing safe and sanitary housing. And then interestingly, in looking at some of the health indicators, so those would be things like rates of asthma, they do appear to be similar in both areas to our citywide rates, which could indicate that maybe there's some other mitigating factors at play, or we're going to start to look at some of the regional data and see how that compares to El Cajon as well. Next slide.
All right, and I think kind of as a segue to discussion, just a recap and planning for the future with these updates. The safety element helps prioritize actions to address the greatest risks to El Cajon in the next 20 years. The environmental justice policies need to reduce pollution and improve health outcomes, address civic engagement, and prioritize investment. And the housing element should consider kind of where we're at with housing development and our community characteristics to help establish those policies and programs to further housing opportunities across all income levels. And then also help us kind of meet those other state mandated goals, which is our RHNA, Regional Housing Needs Assessment Allocation for housing production. And I think with that, kind of concludes the formal portion of the presentation. And